This is a workshop for teachers about engaging students in poetry. My name is Camilla Elliott, and I am Professor of Literature and Media at Lancaster University. One of my main interests is in how literature relates to other arts and other media forms, and that will be a focus of this workshop, as well as other ways to engage students. At the risk of sounding a bit bureaucratic, the goals and the foci of this workshop have to do with managing student expectations of what poetry is and what it does, as well as broadening and raising their expectations. And at risk of sounding formulaic, and I promise this workshop does get much more creative after this opening, I've used the traditional questions, what, who, why, when, where, and how, in order to structure this workshop. So we're going to be looking at what poetry is, who makes it, why, when, where is poetry in culture today, society today, and then finally, how do we engage students in curriculum poems? I think one of the main things is to manage student expectations about what poetry is and what it isn't. And we're going to start with what poetry is not. Poetry is not a disappointing story where nothing much happens. And that's often how students go to poetry. They want some kind of narrative. Of course, there is narrative poetry, but most of what they're studying is a much smaller, bite-sized lyric poem where there may be something happening, but certainly not a chained and linked together series of events that they would be used to consuming in fiction, on television, even in gaming and film and so on. The other thing is that it isn't a message or an idea or an opinion that's been made needlessly complicated by difficult language and poetic devices. And linked to that, it's not a form where the task of understanding it is to turn it back into simple prose. And what I'm hoping to show you, particularly in the middle section of this workshop, where we talk about poetry's relationship to other art forms, is how important it is to stay with a form. But let's think more generally first what poetry is. Poetry is often a close-up examination, and often of a single moment or a single small object. It's like a close-up would be in film. And as a result, poetry thinks more deeply and in more detail about whatever it treats, and often does so from many different angles. So it's a place of slowing down, zooming in, focusing on, and staying with something that's maybe small, and yet opening that up in many different ways through the language of poetry. As a result, poetry often offers new ways of seeing something, hearing, feeling, or thinking about its subjects. And poetry in the process is a form of language that draws on many other art forms, the rhythms of dance, the tones of music, the images of visual art, the structures of architecture, and so forth. The question of who writes poems is closely related to what a poet is. And Emily Dickinson has a wonderful poem, this is just the beginning of this poem, about defining a poet. A poet is someone who distills amazing sense from ordinary meanings and attar, perfume so immense from the familiar species of flowers that died by the back door that we wonder it was not ourselves arrested it before. So a poet might take ordinary words but combine them in ways or use them in ways to make extraordinary meanings and so extraordinary that people think, why didn't I think of that? Or why didn't I say it like that? So one of the things it's good to do is, obviously, and I'm sure you do it, is to discuss with students. Why do people write poetry? If you write poetry, why do you write poetry? And when? And what occasions do you write poetry, or do you see it being written in society? So your students might come up with any number of answers. Since Romanticism, we have the idea that poetry is there to express ourselves and our feelings. But before that, and also since then, poetry's been there to create art, just like you might want to make a painting. It might be to express yourself, but it might also be to create something beautiful, something artistic, something powerful, something disturbing perhaps. Poetry is also a way, as we've glimpsed, that people can explore ideas and experiences and feelings and objects and situations through words, through using language to come at these things from different angles. Of course, you might get students saying, oh, people write poetry to get fame and fortune. Perhaps not today, but certainly in the past. That's a major part of writing poetry, particularly in the Renaissance, the Restoration, the Regency period, and so on, even the Victorians. They might just say more simply that it's a way of communicating with other people. It's a way of sending a message. They might look at ways in which poets are responding to other poets, talking back to them. Can think about the ways and occasions on which poetry gets written to commemorate particular events, and we'll be looking at this later on in the workshop. So one way in which to help students dive into the notion that poetry offers new ways of seeing, hearing, experiencing, thinking, feeling, and writing is to look at something like the Martian School of Poetry, which is a British movement in poetry inspired by the surrealists of the 1930s and also Anglo-Saxon riddles. And it was popular in the 70s and early 80s. James Fenton coined the term Martian School of Poetry to describe poems by two of its most famous practitioners, Craig Raine and Christopher Reid. The idea of the Martian School of Poetry was to get rid of all the sort of formal, dull to them, pragmatic, realist, post-war kinds of writing, and to look at something as if you're a child seeing it for the very first time, or a visitor from another planet trying to make sense of what you're seeing. And the goal of this was to make readers see things freshly and newly. This is probably the most famous Martian school poem, and obviously Martian's there in the title. And one of the things that is really fun to do with students is to see if they can guess what these things are. Now again, the 70s is a little bit dated technologically speaking, but so let's just take a quick look here. Caxtons are mechanical birds with many wings, and some are treasured for their markings. They cause the eyes to melt or the body to shriek without pain. I have never seen one fly, but sometimes they perch on the hand. So these are books named for Caxton, who developed the printing press. The many wings are the many pages, the markings. Some are treasured. The eyes melting, that's crying. The body to shriek without pain, that could be laughing. And they don't fly, but they perch on the hand. And some of these other lines are a little bit more accessible immediately. Mist is when the sky is tired of flight and rests its soft machine on ground. Then the world is dim and bookish, like engravings under tissue paper. So there's an interesting kind of exchange of metaphors where books are words, but then mist is explored through a metaphor of printing or writing or paper. Rain is when the earth is television. It has the property of making colours dark locker that may be dated Model T. Model T Ford is a room with a lock inside. A key is turned to free the world from movement. So quick, there is a film to watch for anything missed. But time is tied to the wrist or kept in a box, ticking with impatience. This would be a good one to get students to guess. So again, a little bit technologically dated. In homes, a haunted apparatus sleeps that snores when you pick it up. That's the dial tone of the phone. If the ghost cries, they carry it to their lips and soothe it to sleep with sounds. And yet they wake it up deliberately by tickling with a finger. So you can read the rest. Toilets and the final lines I think are lovely. At night, when all the colours die, they hide in pairs and read about themselves in colour with their eyelids shut. You can get students to write Martian poems, to analyse Martian poems. This is all a good way of opening up eyes in a very blatant and dramatic way to the things that the curriculum poems might be doing more subtly, and then carry students from the Martian poems into some of the things that are being explored newly in the poems that they're reading. You can have them write poems of their own in groups, perhaps. That might be a good thing to do as a group activity. And here is a student poetry contest entry that was published in The Spectator. And this is something students could perhaps guess what it is. If you want to read this poem and think about it, you'll need to pause the video now, but there it is for your study and for your students. I won't give it away. Now let's move to think about poetry and the arts. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, poetry is affiliated to and engages techniques that are used in music, different sounds, different tones that can sound like different musical instruments in an orchestra. It uses the rhythms of music, but also rhythm arts like dance. The images of poetry, the metaphors, the attempts of poetry, ekphrasis you can call it, to make pictures appear in your minds ties to graphic arts, but also quite literally the way that poems appear on the page, and the fonts and the spaces and the lines have visual components that are also tied to architecture. So these are things to explore with students, and if you have students who are trying to write poetry, it's also something to encourage them to inject into their own poems. I'm going to mention some student activities here, and we will be returning to more activities when we get to a later section of this workshop where we think about where is poetry in society today and how students already engage with it without perhaps understanding or knowing that they are, and how to get them to engage further. But this is just by way of introduction for the poetry and arts section. Some activities that you can do with the poems that you're teaching is to take a poem and set it to different kinds of music and compare the effect on the poem's tone, style, and interpretation of all of those different kinds of music. This is to get students to understand how the sounds of poems, things like alliteration and assonance and so on, are creating feelings and moods and interpretations quite apart from the semantics of words. And you can set the music in dialogue with those kind of formal features. Another thing that you can do is beat out the rhythms of a poem on desks, or tap it gently with pens on paper. And again, discuss the emotions that are generated by those rhythms. You can ask students to dance, step, or move to the rhythms of a poem and think about how that informs and interprets the meaning. With older students, you can ask them, should Bob Dylan, a musician, have won the Nobel Prize for Literature for the lyrics that he wrote to the songs? We will be coming back later in this workshop to think about song lyrics and poetry more specifically, but this is just an activity, an example that you could do. Pictorial arts. There are things that you can do with students to get them to think about a poem. One thing you can do is get them to draw illustrations for a poem. And this is a wonderfully resonant one, which allows you to think about metaphor. It's a 2-line poem by Ezra Pound, The Apparition of These Faces in the Crowd, Petals on a Wet Black Bough. And somebody's actually tried to draw this somewhat literally, and the artist has worked to try and make the faces seem like petals and has put a black bough through the station that encompasses their clothing, the train, and parts of the platform and so on. But you can think more with students about perhaps drawing illustrations for something maybe not quite so literal, something more like this, a metaphor, and to think about that liminal space where words create images that are not literal, that are not trying to paint descriptively what's in the poem, but create metaphors. So any number of things you could do with students around drawing. And if they don't draw, you can ask them to find images on the internet or in other places to work with. What we're coming to inevitably is the hybridity of the visual and the verbal in poetry. The musical hybridity, where sound and meaning, the hybridity of the images and the symbolic words are coming together. And one thing that is great to work with students on, of any age really, but you may have more time with younger students, is something we call calligrams, which are where words create a picture. This is from Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and it's a wonderful example of when the mouse's tail is a tale, a story tale, but it's also an image of a mouse's tail. And the way that this has been created, where the two really can't be separated. The tail, A-L-E, is a tail, A-I-L, and it's both and. There are all kinds of things on the internet, if you do Google images search, where you can ask students to think about poetry in this kind of way. You could have the line of a light bulb and ask them to write words around it, and they can think about what's written here, and they can think about what poetry is for them. And there are some really interesting things. Again, a lot of these are on the internet, Google search, Pinterest, and so on. And I'm using these with the understanding this is educational use, and I am not taking credit for having created these. But you'll see here somebody's done a very interesting poem that's trying to show the central theme that the sun is hot. It's created a sun, and yet it's kind of blowing in one direction, and the words are coming out of the rays of the sun. Then there's the poem next to it, honeybees, sort of shaped a bit like a beehive. There's play with font and images and spacing and three-dimensionality. And then a very historical, traditional way of integrating words and images has to do with illuminated letters from ancient manuscripts, but obviously still going on today. And this might be something, I was not much of an artist at school, but this was something I could have played with at school and just experimented with, trying to see letters as graphic objects and to think about the ways that images and words interpenetrate here quite literally, but also in things like metaphor and simile and so on. The final point here is the idea of poetry as architectural. I mentioned early on that it's not the task of poetry to turn it into simple prose, and to rid it of all of its artistry and all of its craft. Obviously, we do have to have some kind of prose summary at some point, but that isn't the end. That is perhaps just the beginning of getting a handle before diving back into the poem and looking at it as a poem with its form, with its poetic devices. Poetry is architectural, quite literally, in the form of stanzas, lines, font, spacing, punctuation, which may be seen like rivets or connectors between parts of the building. But also, very importantly, poetry creates structures of meaning through specific words. Words are the building blocks of poems. And if you tear all those words out and put other words in, you've lost a great deal of what that poem is and what that poem is setting out to do. And though it's difficult with the time that's often allowed for studying a poem in class, and we are in a very rapid, high tempo society with all kinds of media that are flying by at the speed of light, and students are increasingly going at things really, really quickly, there is a time to slow down and to dissect and to take apart the words of poems. Each word has a particular function. Nouns have a particular kind of function, verbs, adjectives, prepositions, and in addition to the poetic devices and so on. And these can be excellent tools to understanding a poem, but also to writing a good essay about that. And this is something that I'm going to approach in another workshop on approaches to teaching poetry for teachers, but which I do in my videos for students about poetry. We look at particular ways in which they can take one type of building block and use that in writing a powerful essay, integrating that analysis with their interpretation. Here is the next, if you scroll down that page, you can see here many, many different ways in which they have prepared exercises, lessons, classes for you to have a look at and to work with students. If you want to read these, pause on the third slide showing this website, which I'll do next. There will be a link there, as well as a link at the end of this. But pause the video if you want to read further. These are terrific things that they're doing. And they also have some very interesting background materials you might use with more advanced students. And there are also videos you can see there on the right. So you don't need anything more from me on this, and you can probably find more resources than you'll ever have time to use here and elsewhere on the internet. So now, often students think poetry, it's what I do at school, it's what I do in class, and one of the ways to get them more engaged in poetry as something that is vitally interesting to them, hopefully, is to think about more broadly, where is poetry in society today, beyond the classroom? And then to make connections with those forms of poetry to what you're doing in the classroom, but also to bring in a richer array of poetry into the classroom. If you're pressed for time, it may be that you want to start a poetry club, but I'm guessing and hoping that there would be ways to bring some of these things into your classrooms, at least a little bit, and especially if you start young and start early. So, obviously the first thing we have are the lyrics of songs. We've already seen that Bob Dylan was considered to be a Nobel-winning literary poet. And students, it will be an unusual student who isn't keenly interested in some kind of music and doesn't know some song lyrics off by heart, and who isn't moved or inspired by song lyrics. These are the main ways in which we all consume poetry today. Among the many kinds of music, JC has argued that rap is poetry. Now, rap stands for rhythm and poetry. It's a particularly useful kind of music because it is closer to spoken than to sung. I know that there is concern about a lot of rap music being completely inappropriate for students and young people, but there are places where we can find really brilliant rap. The musical Hamilton has both rap and hip hop, and one of the things that astonished critics was when they went to look at the lyrics, how brilliant they are. And they were expecting, yes, the music's great, but many kind of rather elite, white, upper class New York Times kinds of reviewers were condescendingly or else just genuinely appreciative of the brilliance of the words. But another way that you can find rap and hip hop if you want to explore musical rhythms with your students is to just go onto Google and search rap for children. And you'll get all these lists of clean rap songs, some with free downloads. Now, some of these will be totally inappropriate for you. You'll find them facile, but there are places we don't have to give up on rap just because the mainstream, most prominent kind of rap is probably using language and ideas and things that you don't want to do with most students in the classroom, though there may be times where it is appropriate. Another place where there is dynamic, youthful, fabulous poetry going on is performance poetry. There are all kinds of poetry readings, open mics for poetry, and poetry slams, which are performances and competitions. And I took a group of university students to Boston and New York several years ago, and we took them to a poetry slam in the basement of a coffee shop in Boston. And it was, I think, a quarterfinal, semi-final, so it was really impressive material. And they said it was the most powerful experience of their entire trip, and they saw some amazing things in Boston and New York. Now, again, you're going to have to look for poetry slams that are suitable for whatever age your students are. And there are many youth poetry slams. You can type in youth poetry slam and go on YouTube. There's a very good website located in the UK that you can look up here. And this Unislam website, on its website it says, Unislam uses poetry as a tool to engage, inspire and empower. We have created platforms for young people and emerging artists to share their stories on a national scale, providing training and development, opportunities for writers to grow their skills, confidence, and careers. And they host festivals, they do outreach, they have showcases, and they help with careers. This is particularly powerful for students who might not feel as comfortable and at home in mainstream middle class white education, but it is a form of poetry that I've seen used effectively by people of all backgrounds. We talked about who writes poetry, why and when. Well, we've got our poet laureates who are expected to write poems for special occasions, but we also find in society that poems are frequently read at graduations, at funerals, at weddings, other life events. You know, they're on birthday cards and greeting cards, and poetry is somehow seen as a type of art that we want to use to commemorate those things. And I'll be talking a little bit later about activities to do with students that focus on all of these things, including this commemoration. And then there has been an explosion of poetry on social media. And again, we're going to come back to this in a few moments. You may have more ways in which you see poetry today. I'd really appreciate if you'd write and let me know. At the end of the video, there's contact email. I'd love to hear more about your experiences with poetry in wider society. So now let's go and have a look at student activities that we can do based on these things. So you can ask students to bring lyrics that mean something to them or that they admire for their skill, and you can discuss them in class as poems, possibly set them in dialogue with one of the curriculum poems. As I mentioned earlier, discuss with students the feelings, moods, attitudes, and ideas that get generated by the music that accompanies their favorite lyrics and how they affect the words and the understanding and the consumption of those words. I also mentioned beating out rhythms and linking this to poetic meter. And again, analysing the moods and the feelings. I'm just revisiting this here. Setting curriculum poem to music and discussing the effects of that. And then you can also play music and ask students to write words to go with it. So you can just play some music and have them write freely to go with the music. All of this increases their sensitivity to sound and its relation to poetry and rhythm. Commemorative poetry. Of course, you can read and discuss poems written by the Poet Laureate for special occasions, but then you can ask students to write their own poem of an event and then send it to the Poet Laureate as a kind of response to his or her poem. You can also ask them what events should be commemorated and aren't being commemorated, and what should our Poet Laureates be writing about. Write poems about that, and again, send them to the Poet Laureate and say, come on, it's not just the Queen's birthday. We want to hear about other things that are really important to society as a whole. You can sit down with them and analyze poems that are read at weddings, funerals, graduations, inaugurations, on greeting cards. And again, you can set them in dialogue with curriculum poems or just let them be absorbing and thinking about poetry in society. So now one of the things that's been most celebrated about poetry across history is these kind of quotable lines that enter the culture and get repeated and reappropriated and remixed and readapted and reused across centuries. One of the things that's most astonishing to me is how many phrases in Shakespeare we still have today, in spite of all the language that we're not using. Shakespeare's coined so many phrases. He's also now the subject of memes. right? So here's one that I found on Pinterest. I killed most of my characters before Game of Thrones, right? So students are very likely to be familiar with internet memes, or there's also memes generated by other media, phrases, catchphrases, images, snippets of music. And in culture today, these are widely circulated, they're imitated, memed, memes to imitate. So they're memed or they're remixed, they're recombined with new words, new pictures. So this is a really good thing to do with them, is to ask them to analyze some of their favorite memes and why have they caught on? How are they being remixed? How are they being reused? Ask them when you're studying a curriculum poem, if there is a meme in this poem, what would it be? What would the phrase be in this poem that everybody would want to repeat and it's going to be passed down the centuries? And then ask them to write some poetic memes of their own and talk about why they might catch on. If, like me, you want to encourage students to stick with literature and to think about it, and we do have information about the wonderful careers you can get from studying English literature if you want to write to us at Lancaster. But you can look with students at memes about being a literature student. This is one of the famous ones that what my friends think I do, what my parents think I do, what society thinks I do, and so on. And you can get them to engage with their act of being a literature student right now through memes and to create discussions around literature that might encourage them to think about it newly and more positively and differently. There are also all kinds of poetry apps for reading poetry. Poem Hunter has over 1 million poems. Poetry Daily and other apps deliver a daily poem. There are apps for listening to poetry, including slam poetry. There are apps to help people write poetry, although most of them are rhyming dictionaries or how to write fridge poetry or word scrambles. And then there are apps for Instagram poetry where you can write words over pictures, as well as poetry networks. Now, when I came to prepare this workshop for you, I was astonished to discover the power that Insta poetry, that is poetry written for Instagram, has, not only in society and social media, but also in terms of actual print poetry. And what we're experiencing today is an enormous revival of poetry in many forms, largely as a result of Insta poetry. There's an article written by Laura Gallen in 2018, but she writes about a 2017 report by the National Endowment of the Arts in America and the UK statistics from Nielsen Bookscan about book sales. And it showed that the number of poetry readers in 2017 had nearly doubled since 2012. The largest increase was among young adults, especially young women and people of colour, and that this had created a significant shift from the traditional middle-aged male poetry buyer, who now represents only 18% of poetry readership in the UK. In 2017, the top-selling poetry collection was Milk and Honey by a 26-year-old Punjabi Sikh Canadian, Rupi Kaur, who is described as an Insta poet. This has sold, and this sales figure is not up to date, 3.5 million copies and been translated into at least 40 languages. And 11 other Insta poets made it into the top 20 best-selling poets list that year. So these figures certainly indicate the financial success of Insta poetry in book format, but they can only hint at the size of its online readership, which is in the many, many, many millions. Here is a little image that I found on the net, slightly poking fun at Insta poetry, but also articulating how it's created and how important fonts are and spacing and so on. So what can we do with students engaging social media to improve their poetry? Well, we can analyze memes with them. We can ask how they do or don't relate to poetry. We can get them to create memes or remix reams about literature or poetry. We can analyze Insta poems with them and get them to write some, create some, perhaps even using apps. All of these encourage ways to engage. But I'm guessing that most teachers are most interested in how to engage students in curriculum poems. Now, in the UK at GCSE level, there are, in my opinion, significant drawbacks in many of the poems that have been chosen for the curriculum. They, to me, seem to be mostly chosen by middle-aged people or older people remembering their childhood, people who feel that the poems they read in childhood should be studied today as well. They try to engage young people by showing them young men destroyed in World War I, writing about the tragedy of those experiences. And I think that this is a problem. It's not to say that there aren't many students who can just enjoy the poems as their forebears did many years ago. I certainly did. But when you come from having looked at how poetry is in culture and where it is, curriculum poems do often feel quite removed and archaic. So the first thing I would say would be decide whether to discuss this with your students and whether discussing this would be a positive thing, whether it would encourage greater engagement with the curriculum poems. Perhaps it would be a good idea, perhaps it's best not to say anything and just to do all these other activities. That is entirely up to you as a teacher. This is a poem by my favourite poet, but it's a difficult one. It's about imperceptible loss and change. Something you know is there and you realise is now gone but you didn't see going. So let's have a quick look at this poem. I'll just ask you to pause and read this to yourself if you're not familiar with it. Some of you will be teaching it. And then when you're finished reading, press play. Now, the theme of imperceptible departure and loss and change is particularly hard to pin down for anyone, right? But equally problematic is that this poem is written by a middle-aged woman who was a recluse, in love with nature, and it's about the passing of summer into autumn. That's the official subject, But there is, of course, a strong metaphorical subtext of lost relationships, words like grief and perfidy and sequestered, and the guest that would be gone. There's also a sense for a middle-aged author that this is about the fading of life with the passing of time, from the prime of life that has traditionally been associated with summer into middle or the onset of old age, which is associated with autumn. Now, most students may not care at all about passing seasons. They haven't even reached the prime of life, and they're not really thinking about its demise, its decline. And the challenge is, how do you engage students in a poem like this? What I would suggest is that you ask them to think about something in their own lives that disappeared without them really noticing it disappearing. So you'll have a lot of students who have moved from childhood into teenage years. And this is a period of life where all of a sudden a childhood hobby that you loved, it goes away, but you don't even remember giving it up. It just kind of vanishes slowly. Or you might have friends who were childhood friends that just slowly drifted away, and you're suddenly seeing that, hey, they're not in my life anymore. There might be the loss of a relative who's grown old, or a pet who's grown old and can't play with you in the same way anymore, or perhaps even died. There might be ways you used to feel when you read a book or watched a TV show or did an activity, and you just don't feel that anymore. You feel differently than you used to. You may have hopes and dreams about what you want to be when you grow up, or what you think life is like, or what you want for yourself in life that you no longer have. So these are the things to get students to think about. You ask them to write about that. And just as the poem does, you ask them, how did it feel? How did it sound? What did it look like? Where did it go? How did it go? And what kind of metaphors would you liken all of those experiences to? Once they've done that, then you can have them bring their questions and their answers back to the poem and compare their writing to the poet's and set up a dialogue. This engages them. It also is a good mnemonic device to help them remember the poem. It's good practice for close reading and circling words and thinking a bit more slowly. And hopefully it will build skills that can be applied to any poem. On the remaining slides, I have lists of some of the resources that I've discussed in the workshop today. Again, press pause. I don't want to make this video too long. If you have questions, if you have feedback on this, we'd really appreciate hearing from you. We are just beginning to do this work and to make these videos. And if you have requests for other CPD sessions, or if you'd like a synchronous presentation of this one, either in person or online, then just email us at Lancaster University. This is the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing, and we'd really value hearing from you. Thank you for listening, watching, and participating.